سلام دوستان، خیلی خوش آمدین. قسمت چندمی؟ دومی؟
سوال قشنگیه. قسمت دومیم، یعنی تایتل دوممون هستش، ولی در اصل میشه قسمت سومیمون.
درسته.
که در رابطه با هوش هیجانی. سلام عرض میکنم خدمت همه دوستانی که همراه ما بودن، نظرات خودشونو گفتن، برامون کامنت گذاشتن، دغدغه داشتن، ایده دادن، خیلی کمکمون کردن و همه کسایی که بالاخره وقتشون رو در حد این 45 دقیقه یک ساعت در اختیار ما میذارن. امیدوارم یه چیز مفیدی به دست بیاد براشون از این تایمی که ما ازشون میگیریم.
خب بعدش چیه؟ موضوع بعدی که درمونش می‌خوایم صحبت کنیم؟
خب موضوع بعدی که میخوایم صحبت بکنیم، ما تا اینجا در رابطه با خودآگاهی و خودمدیریتی صحبت کردیم. من دوباره میام بالای این درخت صحبت کردم، ما می‌خواستیم در رابطه با هوش هیجانی صحبت بکنیم. هوش هیجانی میگفت هنر ارتباط، شناخت احساسات خودمون، مدیریتش و احساسات دیگران و مدیریت احساسات دیگران. ما تا الان شناخت خودمون و احساساتمون، مدیریت کردنش رو نمیگم یاد گرفتیم، چون اصلا نرفتیم اون سمت. تقریبا تو ویدیوها اونقدر نمیاد روی این موضوع صحبت کنیم، ولی فهمیدیم که درک کردیم که چقدر میتونه مثبت باشه، چقدر نیازش داریم و چطوری میتونیم استفاده بکنیم که بهش برسیم. برای هر کسی، به قول یکی از این ویدیوها گفت، برای هر کسی خودآگاهی یک شکل کاملا متفاوتیه. نمیشه یک دستورالعمل داد و همه بگیم بر اساس این برن به خودآگاهی برسن. بخش بعدی آگاهی اجتماعیه، یعنی درک احساسات و نیازهای دیگران که حالا برای اون میخوایم صحبت بکنیم. توی این بخش ویدئویی که الان هستش بیشتر داره تمرکز میکنه روی این که کلن چطوری، یعنی میشه گفت اونقدر پیدا نکردیم چیزی که بهت بگی که دقیقاً در رابطه با احساسات دیگران چطوری بشناسیم و اینها. کلن رو بحث ایمپروو ایموشنال اینتلیجنس صحبت میکنه که دو تا بخشش همین بخشی که الان میخوایم صحبت کنیم.
Close your eyes. I will now pose a couple of questions to which I would love to have a very honest answer, just by a show of hands. No worries, no one will judge you for it. The first question is, who of you has thought within the past week about whether or not you are an emotionally intelligent person? Now that you think of it, would you consider yourself emotionally intelligent? Please raise your hand if you do so. And who of you has ever worked consciously on your emotional skill? Thank you for sharing. You can now open your eyes again. And thank you also for being so very honest with me. Now I also want to be honest with you. Emotional intelligence is not necessarily my main strength. When I make decisions, I base them solely on my rationale. If friends from school hear me do this talk right now, they will be very surprised, because back then I didn't even consider emotions as something crucial. They weren't logical, I couldn't explain them very well, so why would I care? I never even actively thought about the topic until 5 years ago, when I dropped out of a job because of a burnout. It was then that my very emotional side was revealed. And while I rarely cried before, especially not in front of people, I just couldn't stop the tears from streaming down my face at the most inconvenient of times anymore. Several times a day, I went to the restroom just to hide my suffering. And that made very clear to me that I need to work on this issue. But now, what is it, this mysterious emotional intelligence? When most people think of it, they stop at the term emotional. What do you connect to it? I'd say it has a bad connotation, describing a person having or expressing strong feelings. And this connotation is also then there for emotional intelligence, a misconception that I had as well. However, it's crucial to differentiate between emotional and the value that emotional intelligence can have. Because emotional intelligence is something fundamentally different. It's the ability to identify and manage your emotions and those of others. And it's said to include 3 skills. First, emotional awareness. So empathy towards others, but also towards yourself. Second, the ability to harness emotions and apply them to tasks like problem solving. And third, the ability to manage emotions, which includes regulating your own emotions, but also calming down or cheering up other people. As you can clearly see by this contrast, very emotional people do not necessarily or automatically have a high emotional intelligence, because they may only display their emotions freely without thinking about or knowing why they have them, and maybe not even considering the appropriateness of showing them in the respective situation. Now, lacking emotional intelligence as a kid or teenager meant for me that I would channel things like loneliness or fear, sometimes into aggression. My family background, well, let's say, is improvable. So instead of finding the support that I'd need, I'd rather get it on the basis of, oh, don't be such a crybaby, than anything else. My parents didn't teach me the value of emotions. Therefore, losing friends or breakups would hit me harder than many others, because I could neither fully understand my emotions nor those of the others. They just didn't make sense. I thought, I'm not supposed to feel that way, because I've never learned how to deal with emotions. And with time passing, I realized I'm just one of many people having this issue. Have you ever thought about why people judge or bully each other, be it kids or at work, or even in toxic friendships or relationships? And it can be anything, ranging from sexism to racism. It's because of insecurity due to a lack of emotional intelligence, because it's hard to understand the difference between yourself and someone else. And it's even harder to connect on an emotional level to truly comprehend where someone else is coming from. And in order to change that, we first of all need to consider emotional intelligence as a crucial skill in our society, and then also take the time to consciously work on it. Currently, we do neither. And we also don't give our kids, for example, the space to learn the skill. Kids nowadays, they are supposed to be good in school, do sports, play an instrument, learn a foreign language, and maybe even some additional things. They don't get the chance to get to know who they are, connect to themselves and to their emotions. And a fundamental part of being emotionally intelligent means knowing who you are. And for them to learn, we also need to learn it ourselves to be the role model that they need. Now you might be thinking, yeah, sure, but how do we approach this topic individually, but also as a society? And basically, it comes down to what everything comes down to. We need to learn a new skill. So when you learn a new skill, you first of all need to become aware of your incompetence in the field. So I got there with my burnout. I'm pretty sure that you can manage that more easily. And then you work on the skill until you manage it to the level that you want. And after a while, you will even be able to apply it without actively thinking about it. Take, for example, your driver's license. After a while, you stop thinking, oh, I need to put in the next gear. You just do so. Unconscious competence achieved. Now, the tricky thing, though, is to get from conscious incompetence to conscious competence. And we do that by learning the basics of how a car works and by practicing. So in the beginning, it's maybe difficult to steer the wheel at the same time as putting in the next gear, but after a while, it gets easier. And with emotional intelligence, it's basically the same thing. So I tried to compile my experiences and came up with a 6-step guide that hopefully helps people to get more emotionally intelligent. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to acknowledge our emotions. But not only as such, but as something valuable, because that's what they are. According to research by Antonio Damasio, people whose brain parts that are responsible for emotions have been damaged found themselves even having a harder time taking rational decisions. That's
بازم برگشتیم به آسیب پذیری.
آره یه چیزی اونجا من داشتم بهش فکر می‌کردم همزمان که در مورد این موضوع داشت صحبت می‌کرد این هستش که واقعا ما بعضی موقع احساساتمون رو میدونیم ولی نمیتونیم بیانشون بکنیم و من یه چیز جالبی از یه نفر یاد گرفتم میگفتش که لزوما لازم نیست روی حست اسم بذاری که من مثلا نمیدونم الان دارم احساس خشم رو تجربه میکنم میتونی بگی که به فرض دارم میگم من خشمگینم مثلا حدش رو مشخص کنی یکم مثلا ناراحتم نمیتونم روش اسم بذارم ولی مثلا ویژگی های فیزیکی رو توصیف کنم مثلا اینکه احساس میکنم توی دلم آشوبه چون آخه خیلی موقع ما به خاطر اینکه اسمشو نمیدونیم از گفتن اون فرار میکنیم که نمیدونم چه حسی دارم ولی خیلی جالب بود که گفت خب ما 5 تا چیز احساس اصلی داریم اونا رو بر اساس طیف بگیم و علاوه بر اون احساسات بدنی رو بهش اضافه بکنیم باعث میشه طرف بیشتر خودش رو تو موقعیت ما ببینه حتی احساس همدردی بهتری ایجاد بشه راحت‌تر بتونه با همون راه بیاد و کنار بیاد
خیلی قشنگ گفتی آفرین خیلی قشنگ برای خود من خیلی راحت بود
how valuable they are. And the very first small but simple thing that you can do is you can ask people with genuine interest how they are feeling. And when you're asked, answer with authenticity. When you feel good, but also when you feel bad. So no, I'm fine, but also no complaining. Instead of complaining about your colleagues, say, I don't feel appreciated at work, or whatever it comes down to. Make it an I message. And when people show emotions, tell them that it's okay to have those. Talk about them. Erase the taboo that I feel exists in our society of talking about emotions, because that's more often than not the one thing that keeps us from making the next step. And the next step is differentiating and analyzing emotions. So sometimes when we talk about or express a feeling, we substitute the original one with one that we think we know better or are better at handling. But there are actually a lot of different emotions, and all of them have their functions. And all of them might also need you to handle them differently. Therefore, it's important to get down to the core. And then you also need to accept and appreciate all those emotions. Because emotions are neither good nor bad. They just gain connotation through society. Take, for example, grieving or sadness. Why do we so desperately try to cut it out of our lives? Because actually, it's just a very beautiful illustration of the appreciation that we have for someone or something. Now, I approach all 3 steps by writing my emotions down in a journal just for that. On need basis, so not necessarily daily, but sometimes only every few weeks, or maybe even only every few months. Friends of mine do similar things with apps if you want to be more modern. And then there is the next step, reflecting on your emotions and their origin. Because sometimes just knowing why we feel the way you do already helps us handle the feeling. Again, for me, covered when I write them down, because it gives me time to actively think about them. And then you get to handling your emotions. Because That's what it's all about, isn't it? And as said, reflecting might already suffice. But it might not. And you may still need to find your way on how to handle your emotions. Because there is more than one way to skin a cat, and I can only give you a few examples of what I did. And what helped me, if not handle the emotion, but at least find out how to handle it, was writing it down, because it put distance between me and my emotions. There has even been a study conducted on the positive effects of written expression of emotions by Pennebaker and Smith, and they published it in their book, Opening Up by Writing It Down, if you want to check it out. Because that's actually another thing that I do. I read on a topic. Currently, I'm reading Language of Emotions by Carla McLaren. Literally any book by Brené Brown is good to go, but there are so many more. And I talk to friends. I ask them, how do you approach this situation? How do you approach that topic or this emotion? And then it's more or less a trial and error principle. Sometimes it may be sports, sometimes it may be meditation. It's just important that you find your individual way. And then handling the emotions of others. And I'd say
این مرحله 4 که میگه که در مورد مثلا انعکاس بدین احساسات خودتون رو، خیلی برمیگشت به همون قسمت قبلی که داشتیم میدیدیم. یعنی فیلم قبلی که توی پارت قبل دیدیم در مورد این بود که میگفت برین سراغ وایس، سراغ منشأش خیلی عمیق نشین. آره خب تو مرحله بعد داره این موضوع رو جبران میکنه. میگه که آره در مورد این صحبت بکنین که منشأش از کجا میاد، ولی بعد برین سراغ هندل کردنش. سوالتون رو تغییر بدین از وایی که اون داشت میگفت به وات، که مثلا بتونین برین سراغ مرحله بعد. این دو تا ترکیبش جالب شدن برای من با هم.
As soon as you master your emotions, but also in the process of getting better at it, you will find it easier and easier to also handle the emotions of others because you have a different understanding. And understanding and awareness are the keys. It gets even easier because you can simply ask the other person how you can support them, because they might know. Or you can also ask them how they can support themselves. Because that way, you not only help them in the acute situation, but you actually help them develop their emotional intelligence. And then, when we have a few people being emotionally intelligent, we also need to think about how can we teach our next generation. And as a society, I feel the most important thing that we need to do is implement emotional education in school. Teach children about the different emotions and their functions. Give them a space to openly talk about them so that they can acknowledge their emotions. Help them to accept and appreciate them. To be honest, it's not that difficult. Most of the things that I mentioned can be easily put into practice in schools. I mean, how many books have you read in school? Why not make some of them about emotional intelligence? Or make kids work on case studies together so that they can exchange their ideas on how to approach topics. And if we're lucky, they get out of school having learned this fundamental and crucial skill of emotional intelligence. Imagine the world that we would be living in. If every one of us was emotionally intelligent, what do you think would change? Being emotionally intelligent means knowing and understanding yourself. Thus, it helps you make better decisions. It would spare us from emotional suffering because we know where it comes from and we know how to handle it, and maybe not even impose it upon others. It would help us deal with interpersonal relationships because we also connect on a different level. And interpersonal relationships are everywhere. Just think about it. What would it mean to have an emotionally intelligent boss? Or what would it mean to have an emotionally intelligent parent? If we were all emotionally intelligent, how would we approach differences? Or how would we approach topics like mental health? Or how would we approach conflicts? Just imagine the world that we would be living in. A world full of mutual understanding, acceptance, tolerance, and connection. A truly inclusive world. How awesome would that be? Thank you.
خیلی عالی.
تمرینایی که برای این قسمت داریم چیا هستن؟
خب توی بحث آگاهی اجتماعی ما بعد از اینکه خودمون رو شناختیم، مدیریت تونستیم بکنیم، حال خودمون رو، عواطف خودمون رو، لحظه‌ای که باید حالا بتونیم طرف مقابل رو اولین قدم اینه که بشنویم. برمیگردیم دوباره به قسمت قبل هنر ارتباط موثر، گوش دادن فعال. یعنی تمرینی که ما تو قسمت قبلم برای گوش دادن فعال گذاشتیم و سکوت و گوش بدیم به صحبت طرف مقابل یکی از اتفاقات هست. و یک اتفاق دیگه که توی آگاهی اجتماعی، تمرین دیگه که میتونه کمک بکنه، درک، بهتر اینجوری بگیم، تجسم کردن خودمون جای طرف مقابل. یعنی پا بذاریم تو کفش طرف مقابل. اینکه برای اینکه بتونیم بفهمیم آقا چرا فلانی، حالا لزوما نه احساساتا، چرا مثلا فلانی تصمیم گرفت که این ماشین رو بخره، خودمون تصور کنیم وقتی تصور میکنیم جای اون میذاریم خودمون رو، این بهمون کمک میکنه که یواش یواش در جاهای مختلف احساسات دیگران رو هم ببینیم، تصمیمات دیگران رو هم درک بکنیم و بفهمیم.
در مورد این گوش دادن فعاله، من حالا یه تکنیکی جدیداً باهاش آشنا شدم، خیلی جالبه، حالا گفتم شاید بگم به درد بخوره. این هستش که مثلا وقتی دو نفر میخوان با هم دیگه مکالمه بکنن، ولی خب اینطوری هستش که هی تو حرف هم میپرن، هی به حرف هم دیگه گوش نمیدن، انگار مثلا هر کس تایم خودش رو داشته باشه. نفر اول 30 ثانیه صحبت میکنه، بعد ساکت میشه، نوبت نفر دوم 30 ثانیه صحبت میکنه و این موضوع باعث میشه که خیلی متقابل و در تعامل همدیگه انگار صحبت بکنن و مجبور بشن به حرف طرف مقابل یه جوری گوش بدن.
حرف قشنگیه ها، ولی اگر طرف گوش دادن فعال رو بلد نباشه، فکر میکنم بیشتر به خطا بره این کار. میره همون بحثی میشه که توی مناظره‌های انتخاباتیه، طرف 5 دقیقه وقت داره حرف بزنه ولی 5 دقیقه حرفش واسه بغل دستیش نیست، واسه تلویزیونه و اونم داره برای خودش فکر میکنه که تو 5 دقیقه خودش چی بگه. مثلا این گوش دادن فعالی وجود نداره به نظرم. من تو اون 30 ثانیه که تو مثلا داری حرف میزنی، تو داری حرفتو میزنی، ولی من دارم فکر میکنم خیلی خوب ادامه 30 ثانیه قبلمون چی بگم، الان داره این جواب خواهم گفت بعدن. یعنی باز دوباره من گوش دادن فعال خیلی جواب بیشتری داره. تو اصلا بشینی 2 ساعت حرف بزنی، من ساکت بشم تمام 2 ساعت فقط دغدغه‌های تو رو بشنوم و خودم رو بذارم جای دغدغه‌های تو، جای دلایل تو. این خیلی بیشتر فکر می‌کنم جواب میده
تا این کارو می‌خوایم بکنیم.
آره.
منطقی.
حالا ما یه مقداری نسبت به بحث آگاهی اجتماعیمون بهبود داشتیم، رفتیم جلوتر. تو بحث بعدی اینه که خیلی خوب، حالا من فهمیدم که طرف مقابلم هم چه چیزی داره. یه حرف خیلی خوبی تو این ویدیو زد، تو ویدیو قبلی بود فکر کنم که خیلی اینجا میگنجه، اینی که ما در نهایت، به نظر من هم البته نظر شخصیمه، ما ظالم نداریم، لزوما نمیشه گفت آدم ظالمی، آدم بد نداریم. هر کسی از زاویه دید خودش، در جایگاه دید خودش داره بهترین تصمیم برای خودش میگیره. یعنی اگه من تصمیم میگیرم مثلا فلان کار رو انجام بدم که ممکنه روی تو تأثیر بدی بذاره، از دید من یک اتفاق خوبی که برای من داره میشه. اینجا تا اینجای داستان اتفاق بدی هست، به خاطر اینکه برای دیگران اتفاق بدی رقم میزنه. اما وقتی که ما 2 نفر بشینیم صحبت بکنیم، خودمون رو بذاریم جای همدیگه، درک بکنیم دلایل تصمیمات و دلایل احساسات و رفتارهای همدیگه رو، حالا میتونیم بگیم خیلی خوب، پس تو هم کار بدی نکردی لزوما از زاویه خودت. حالا من میتوانم با این درک و با این شناخت دو تا داستان برسم به این رو که خیلی خوب، حالا چیکار بکنیم که این تعارض منافعی که اتفاق افتاده برطرف بشه. چون میفهمیم که حالا از این به بعد، از این جای داستان بعد، آقا دلیل این که من فلان رفتار عاطفه رو بد دیدم اینه، یا عاطفه فلان رفتار من رو بد دیده، اینه که جای همدیگه نذاشتیم همدیگه. بعد که گذاشتیم جای همدیگه، آقا من یه سری منافعی داشتم که منافع من با رفتار خودم تامین می‌شده، با رفتار تو نه. و تو برعکس. اینجا پس یه سری تعارض منافع داشتیم که این حس رو بهمون داده. بنابراین تو مدیریت روابط بین دو طرف، بین چند طرف توی یک جایی می‌خوایم روابط رو توی اجتماع کنترل بکنیم، باید ببینیم که این منافعی که وجود داره تعارضش و رفعش چه شکلیه و اونها رو برطرف بکنیم. این بهش میگن مدیریت روابط
که میشه قسمت آخره،
قسمت
آخرین عنصر از این موضوع. بریم فیلمشو ببینیم با هم.
البته اینجا هم شاید اونقدر ما دقیق نتونستیم ویدئویی پیدا کنیم که دقیق بتونه روی این بحث فوکوس بکنه.
If you met me as a child, you would have seen a girl with glasses that were so big it took up half her face, while the lower half was filled with a lot of metal. I had metal braces and it came with a tasteful neck gear that was basically a piece of wire that went into one side of my mouth, out around my neck, and in the other side. Now, as if that wasn't enough, I decided to complete the look by wearing my older brother's hand-me-downs, as well as clipping this huge bow on the top of my ponytail every single morning. Now, every time I shared this story with my friends, they would look at me and say, "Oh, man, you must have had a lonely childhood." I don't blame them. I personally would have thought so myself, except it wasn't. I learned at a young age, you are never lonely if you can connect. I guess I have my father to thank. When he was a child, my great uncle approached my grandfather and told him that he was going to leave China. He wanted to build a better future for himself. So he told my grandfather, I can take one child, claim it as my own, and give that one child a better life. My grandfather chose my father. It was between him and his younger sister. At a young age of 10, my father left everything he knew, followed his uncle to a land full of mostly strangers. So growing up, it was basically the four of us, my brother, me, my mom, and dad, because eventually he came to Canada when he was in his early 20s. But we were never lonely. My dad had this amazing ability to connect with people, and our lives and memories were always filled and surrounded by people that cared and loved us. And that's when I realized family didn't have to be about blood relations. Family was something we can create. And from that point on, building connections became a huge part of my life. I even became a clinical counselor, where building connections is a necessity for helping others. As Natasha said, I work at Vancouver General Hospital's Psychiatry Department. I provide individual and group counseling to people struggling with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, adjustment and personality disorder. Now, before I share my secrets with you onto how to become a relationship ninja, I have to highlight, sometimes building connections can be kind of a tricky thing to do. It can take time, effort, commitment, courage, and like today's conference theme, for us to take the lead. One thing I learned as a child, that in order to build strong connections with others, you really have to be strongly connected with yourself. You have to really know yourself. By that I mean, you gotta know what you like, what you don't like, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and of course, what your strengths and weaknesses are. As much as it's important to focus and use our strengths, a lot of times we actually forget it's just as important to acknowledge and unconditionally accept our weaknesses. Only by embracing our weaknesses do we actually become more grounded and more stronger as a person. Otherwise, you might find yourself feeling easily offended by people, and you actually might end up coming off as a little bit defensive. As a child, I would get asked by other kids occasionally, "Hey, what's on your face?" And because I was embarrassed about what I had to wear, I would snarl back with, "Nothing. What's wrong with yours?" Now, I quickly learned, apparently that was not the quickest way to be making friends. And it honestly wasn't until I accepted that my looks were a part of me and something I couldn't change for a while that I actually began to focus on one of my strengths, my sense of humor when interacting with people. And soon after that, I started making many, many friends. And despite the fact that I still looked the same, I was a much happier kid. And even though people still ask me that same question, it no longer felt like we're digging in an open wound. Instead, it was just another question. A lot of times when we're building connections, we have a tendency to want to show people our good side, and just our good side, which makes sense. We're trying to make a good impression, hopefully build a long-lasting connection. Now, take a moment. I want you all to think about people that you feel closest to you. People that you feel most connected to. Take a moment, imagine their faces. Got it? I guarantee they've seen your good side and your not so good side. It isn't until we're able to accept and embrace ourselves for who we really truly are that others can do so as well. And that's how we build strong connections. I worked with teenagers for 10 years, and I have to say, they trained me well on this concept. Don't take it personally. I talk about non-filtering verbalization. If I was to take everything they said personally, I wouldn't even be here today. I'll be living in some remote island, trying to be void of any human contact. One interesting thing I actually learned about this concept just a few years ago is that sometimes what people say, as much as it kind of hurts a little bit, actually might not completely be about you. Instead, it can be a reflection of their way of thinking, their current emotional state, or their patterns of behavior. One day I was at work, and I had a colleague burst into my office because they had this juicy secret that she just had to tell me. So I could use a break. I listened to the secret, and after she was done, on her way out, I remembered she turned around. She looked at me in the eye and said, "Now remember, don't tell anyone, because you kind of have a big mouth sometimes." My head exploded. I'm like, did she just say I had a big mouth? Me, a trained counselor, where confidentiality is like the #1 rule? At that time, I knew I had only 2 choices. One, I can consult my colleague, ask for more clarification. But I kind of felt like I might be walking in an open minefield. So I decided to do the next best thing. I went to a colleague I trusted, and I told her the story. Now, of course, I did not tell her the secret. Otherwise, I just confirmed the accusation that was made of me. I remember her reaction. She was like, "What? No!" Oh, thank goodness. If anything, she just told you a juicy secret, and everyone knows if you tell her something, the whole department's gonna know by the end of the day. Now, I actually did know that, but it felt good to consult in someone I trust. So sometimes, if you feel like someone said something that really hurt, either ask for clarification or do what I did. Ask someone that you trust. The next one is my favorite. Bad vibes. How many of you out there just met someone, you just talked to them, or you barely know them, maybe had just a few words here and there, but for some reason, the moment you saw them, you just didn't like them? Put up your hand. Let's see a show of hands. That's right, let's be honest. Okay, put it down. Now, for the sake of my presentation, I'm not gonna ask how many of you had that feeling when you saw me come out on stage. And I do sincerely apologize if your neighbor looked at you before putting up their hand. Now, bad vibes, that's a really interesting thing. We always say, "Oh, he gave me a bad vibe," or "she's giving me a bad vibe." But in reality, they actually didn't. They didn't do anything. All they did was come into your line of vision What happened was you saw them, and then you decided, I don't like that person, and you labeled them with bad vibes. I remember when I was 16, and I had my first day of volunteer work at a day camp, and I came home telling my father how, there was this other volunteer that I just didn't like. I remember my dad looking at me saying, why? You don't even know her. And I remember looking at my father in the eye and saying, you know how it is. You just sometimes meet people and you don't like them, but you don't know them at all. And I remember my father was like, he's like thinking, where did my 16-year-old daughter go, and how did she get replaced with this old lady filled with wisdom that just spoke one of the unsaid truths of human interaction? So all he said was, go finish your Chinese soup. So the next time you have a bad vibe from someone, take some time. Ask yourself what it is about that person that really bothered you. It might not be a fun task, but I guarantee you will actually learn more about yourself. Now, human beings, we're all amazing storytellers. Every single one of us. We tell ourselves stories all the time. Some of us are loud storytellers. Some of us are a bit more quiet storytellers. But we tell ourselves over 50 stories a day about ourselves, about our family, about our friends, and even strangers. It's how we interact with the world. Now, that's all fine and dandy until we forget that they're stories. And we start telling ourselves that they are facts. Judgments and assumptions. Sometimes when I'm working with my clients, I'll point out, you just made a judgment or assumption. And they'll be like, what? I did? No, I didn't. And a lot of times, it could be a hard thing to catch, because at some point, we tell ourselves stories so often, it just became second nature. So judgments usually would have some evaluative term, maybe pretty, ugly, big, small, right, or wrong. And with assumptions, it usually would have the word should, always, and must. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone that can actually read minds. But I do know a lot of people that don't appreciate being judged and don't appreciate having assumptions made about them. Before I came into this field, and like most of you as well, you might actually think that counselors, psychologists, therapists, they must be these relationship ninjas. They must have these amazing relationships with family, friends, peers. And I actually thought so too. In fact, if I heard a marriage counselor was getting a divorce, I'll be thinking, maybe that counselor's not too good, which is funny because we don't judge a medical doctor's ability to help people by how many times he or she gets sick. But the one thing I realized when I came to the field was, there were two things that I learned. One, from the moment you received your training, it's almost as if someone put these microscopic glasses on you and you suddenly see every single characteristic trait about everybody you see. All the good and all the not so attractive traits as well. In fact, sometimes I find that I often have to turn off my brain when I'm talking to people. Otherwise, I will start overanalyzing their words and overanalyzing the behavior. That's when I realize, ignorance is bliss sometimes. Secondly, even though clinical psychologists and counselors, yes, we are equipped with more skills to overcome social hurdles. However, it still takes two to build a connection. And no matter how hard you try, if the other person isn't putting any effort, you wouldn't be able to build any connections. Next is about, it's all in the delivery. There we go. A lot of times, we kind of hate communication. It feels like such a pesky thing to do. Unfortunately, we're stuck with it. And actually, at a young age, I realized it's actually not hard to be honest with people. It's not what you say. It's actually how you say it that ultimately affects the other person. Imagine this. If you were to give someone a present, which would be better received? One where you shove them a brown paper bag, or one where it was very obvious you put time and effort into putting the present into a nicely gift-wrapped box? I think we can all agree on the latter. I call this communication gift wrapping. I always tell my clients, when you're trying to tell someone something, just actually take some time, put some effort in. Think about what is it that you really want to say. Try to keep it simple. Try not to talk too much or ramble on, otherwise people might feel a little confused and actually misinterpret what it is you're actually really trying to say. Now, we all struggle sometimes with telling people news that might be bad. What I always suggest is, why don't you pose it as a suggestion for exploration, rather than something etched in stone. And it never hurts to highlight why it is beneficial for this person to know this new piece of information, even if it hurts. I was wedding shopping with a friend of mine a few years ago, and she was trying on wedding dresses, and after 2, I remember her looking at me going, "Oh, nothing fits well. I feel so fat. I look fat, don't I?" I think we all can agree, whew, dangerous position to be in. I remember looking at her and saying, "Well, I just don't think those dress styles suit your body type right now." You'd think I would have dodged a bullet there. Unfortunately, she didn't let me off the hook, and the closest exit was too far away for me. So she's like, "You do think I'm fat, don't I?" And I actually ended up sticking to the facts. I asked her right back, I'm like, "Well, have you been eating differently? Do your clothes feel different? Have you been exercising less?" And you know what? I think you can all guess. I didn't even have to answer the question. She came to her own conclusion. And she didn't hate me afterwards either. A lot of times, people tell us that, "I don't care if I'm lonely," but let's face it, no one really wants to be lonely. And it's true. We often forget you're honestly never lonely when you connect. It's only through connections that brings out care, compassion, love, empathy, and humanity in all of us. Unfortunately, it is when we're disconnected that people do things that hurt themselves and others in the world, like we see in the news today. So I challenge you all here today, over the next break, next day, next week, next month, next year, make a connection. You'd be surprised at the impact that can have on you and the other person. For some of you in the audience, you know that I just had my second child earlier this year. I also have an older daughter named Rachel. And it's been a challenging task trying to prepare for this talk and take care of a newborn son. But I figured, what's a better way to build a talk about building connections than to implement it on my son? So I practiced with him every single day, and it didn't take me long to get a reaction out of him. I even took a picture. I still love him. I didn't give up. Remember, building connections takes time. Sometimes it can take a lot more effort. So I kept going, and I kept trying, and I kept trying, and finally, I got a different reaction out of him. Remember, don't take it personally. Thank you.
خب خیلی جالب بود این فیلمم و جمله آخرش که دقیقاً برمیگرده به این که میگه مسائل و این اتفاقات رو به خودتون نگیرید، به شخصیت خودتون وارد نکنید، خیلی مهمه. ما باید یاد بگیریم، یعنی باز دوباره جدا از اینکه دیگران هم به اون اتیکت میزنن، خودمون هم اون اتیکت رو نبریم تو خودمون بشینیم باش فکر کردم که داستان غم انگیزه. برای حالا کلا بحث مدیریت روابط، یکی از چیزایی که برمیگرده گفتم مشکلی که بین آدم‌ها ایجاد میشه، اون تعارض منافع است که بین آدم‌ها باعث ناراحتی میشه، درک نکردن احساسات همدیگه میشه. برای رفعش اینه که تو خودت دقیقاً بذاری جای اون و اون جمله‌ای که اشاره می‌کرد توی یکی از کتابایی که داشتم می‌خوندم این بودش که میگفت تکنیک آی، یعنی بیای به جای یو از کلمه آی استفاده بکنی. هر جایی که تو میخوام در تو بگم من اینجوری. بعد وقتی که این کار می‌کنی یواش یواش در طول مدت مثلا تو اون بحثه خودتو در جایگاه طرف مقابل می‌بینی، احساسات طرف مقابل رو درک می‌کنی، تعارض منافع رو پیدا میکنی، منافع رو مشترک میکنی و حال هر دوتون، حال هر جنداتون، حال اون شرکت، بیزینس، همه چی اونجا حالش خوب میشه. تا اینجای صحبتمون خب ما موارد مختلف رو گفتیم. میرسیم به بخش آخر صحبتمون
که بخش فیلم هستش،
بخش فیلم و کتاب که میخوایم معرفی بکنیم.
خب چه فیلمایی برامون آوردی آقا؟
برای فیلم و پادکست که من میخواستم بگم، اول خیلی کوچولو بگم که کلا توی علم، یعنی شناخت روانشناسی EQ و هوش هیجانی، آقای دنیل گولمن هستش که خیلی معروف هستش توی این حوزه. که آقای گولمن رو ما لینک دو تا از ویدیوهای صحبت ایشون رو و کتاب‌های ایشون رو معرفی می‌کنیم بیشتر، و 2 تا لینک ویدیو رو من قرار میدم داخل کپشن ویدیو آخرمون که حتما پیشنهاد میکنم این 2 تا فیلم رو ببینین که این مقدار فضا بازتر میشه، توضیحات این مقدار بهتر هستش توی اون. این میشه اون حالا پادکست، حالا چیزی که فکر میکردیم کنار اینجا معرفی کنیم. ولی فیلم، من خیلی فیلم ها رفتم سرچ کردم که بخواد خیلی خوب نشون بده بحث هوش هیجانی رو، و خیلی فیلم هایی رو اسم آورد و این جای مختلفش رو شنیدم و حالا از چت جی پی تی استفاده کردم. اما داشتم توی لیست 250 تا میگشتم، یک فیلمی رو دیدم که فکر میکنم تقریبا بشری نباید باشه که این فیلم رو ندیده، و اگر هم ندیده همینجا اسمشو که من گفتم فیلمو پاز بکنه، یوتیوبو پاز بکنه، حق داره حتی لایک نکنه ولی بره و این فیلمو ببینه. چون جدای از این که این فیلم واقعا تو بحث EQ خیلی به آدم کمک میکنه، حال خوبی داره این فیلم، یعنی برای حال خوبم که شده یه بار این فیلمو ببینید. اسم فیلم این برنامه‌مون فارست گامپه. فکر کنم هیچ حرفی نیست روش بخوام بزنم. من اصلا هیچ تحلیلی نمیخوام بکنم فارست گامپو، هیچ، یعنی نمیخوام دیپ بشم توش، تحلیل کوچولو صحبت دارم براش که چرا انتخابش کردیم. اما واقعا میشه گفت نمونه بارز یک انسانی که EQ شاید مثلا میشه گفتش 1000 داره ولی لزوما IQ نداره. اینجا میبینیم که با EQ و با استفاده از هوش هیجانیش، هوش لحظه‌ایش، هوش تصمیماتی که درستی که توی اون لحظه باید یک انسان بگیره، و به خاطر نداشتن، حس من اینه که فارست گامپ توی این فیلم شخصیت سرزنش کننده نداره تو خودش، شخصیتی که نگران باشه الان به خاطر این تصمیم چه تصوری میکنه دیگران با نسبت بهش، مادرش چه تصوری داره نسبت بهش به خاطر این تصمیمش، همکارش، هم رزمش، هم فکرش، هر جای اون کسی که کنارشه قطعا نظرات مخالف فارست گامپ داره. اما فارست گامپ به خاطر حالا شاید میشه گفتش که شاید هوش ذهنیش، هوش علمیش که پایین هستش به خاطر مشکلاتی که داره، و تصمیمی که میگیره تصمیمی که یک انسان با هوش هیجانی بالا میگیره، و چقدر دستاوردهای عجیبی برای این آدم به وجود میاد به خاطر این داستان. پس فارست گامپ، یعنی اصلا من هیچ فیلمی فکر نکنم به اندازه فارست گامپ بتونه هوش هیجانی رو خوب بگه. بعد از بحث حالا معرفی فیلممون، ما 2 تا کتاب رو قطعا پیشنهاد میدیم که همه بخوننش، که کتاب اصلی کلا اسمش ایموشنال اینتلیجنس که مال آقای دنیل گولمن هستش که میشه گفت پدر علم هوش هیجانی محسوب میشه ایشون، و یکی هم کتاب عرضم به حضورتون Dare to Lead هست که این کتاب هم با رویکرد عملی که روی بحث هوش هیجانی داره خیلی چیزای جالبی میگه. من خودم نشسته این کتاب دومو نخوندم، صرفا نقدهاش رو نگاه کردم، ولی خب کتاب ایموشنال اینتلیجنس دنیل گولمن کتاب خیلی خوبیه، حتما پیشنهاد میشه. اون ویدیوهای دنیل گولمن هم خیلی پیشنهاد میشه. این میشه گفتش که نتیجه تحقیقات ما، بررسی ما، تمرینای خودمون و کارهایی هم که خودمون تصمیم داریم که توی این مدت انجامش بدیم برای همراهامون بود. خیلی دوست داریم که حالا من جمع بکنم صحبت، خیلی دوست داریم که نظراتتون رو به همون بگید.
اگه فیلم دیگه ای میشناسین، کتاب دیگه ای میشناسین، نویسنده دیگه ای میشناسین، حتما کامنت بکنین، ما روش میریم دوباره نگاه میکنیم، فکر میکنیم و حتی اگه دیدیم لازم بود یه دونه ویدئوی ساپورت دیگه هم براش درست میکنیم.
آره حتما این کار انجام میدیم. مرسی. لایک بکنید، ما رو به دوستاتون معرفی بکنید، خیلی خوشحال میشیم، چون نه به این خاطر که دوست دنبال رشد مثلا یوتیوبمون نیستیم، بیشتر دنبال اینیم که آدمای بیشتری ببینن و آدمای بیشتری استفاده خودشون رو بکنن و به ما هم راهنمایی بکنن، ما هم بتونیم استفاده بکنیم.
در واقع می‌خوایم آدمای بیشتری کانکت بشیم.
دقیقاً. خونه آخرش اینه که اون لحظه‌ای که دوست داریم حال خیلی خوبتر باشه، چون فکر می‌کنیم با دونستن اینها حال خیلی خوبه. مثلا با جمله فکر می‌کنم آخری ویدیو یکی مونده به آخرمون که قشنگ گفت تصور بکنیم که یک مدیری داریم که ایموشنال اینتلیجنس خیلی عالی داره، همسری داریم که ایموشنال اینتلیجنس خیلی عالی داره، دوستی داره، دنیا چقدر قشنگ میشه. پس دونستن تمام این سافت اسکیل ها واقعا حال هممون رو خوب میکنه، حال خیلی آرامش به هممون میده. ممنونم که همراه ما بودید، وقت گذاشتید، وقتتون شاید خیلی طولانی شد، خیلی گرفتیم. مرسی.
بله، مراقب خودتون باشین تا ویدیوهای بعدی. خدا نگهدار.
مرسی، خدا نگهدار.